For 16 or 17 of the last centuries, it has been the popular belief that women are to occupy a subservient role in the church. It's interesting to note that Jesus was 20 centuries ago, not 16 or 17. But 16 or 17 centuries ago, this became the popular belief of the church. Someday I hope to teach on how that transition came about. But today we will consider Jesus' relationship with women and how he himself lived contrary to this popular belief. The UCC has always rejected any distinction of gender. Unfortunately, always dates all the way back to 1959, or maybe 1957, depending on how you trace the lineage of the UCC. But it didn't just start right there. Fortunately, Antoinette Brown was ordained as a Christian minister back in 1853. So we have a century and a half to our credit as Congregationalists, those people who got off the boat called the Mayflower. And we lay claim to them because they ultimately are the central player in the United Church of Christ. So we will say that, well, at least for a century and a half, we've gotten it right around here. And we've proven it. And of course, when the UCC was founded, there was absolutely no distinction tolerated in status in the UCC, whether you're clergy or layperson. Now, the UCC learned not to subjugate women, not to put them in a subservient role, from who? Jesus. He's the guy, however, that is usually blamed for setting the precedent. Usually when people say, well, Jesus didn't get married, therefore, and unless you read certain authors, modern authors named Brown, you believe that. But Jesus didn't get married, so we know what Jesus' relationship to women was. It was kind of a distant thing. But was it really? Because, well, one of the reasons that we have a rocket on the opening slide is because Jesus gave me a profound amount of material to work with this morning. There are many times when Jesus interacted with women, and I think that there is a great deal to be found in those interactions. Now, since we're going to unteach something that is centuries old, I will use that ancient teaching technique that I learned in seminary. I'm starting to feel a little ancient myself these days. So here is how my preaching professor untied the minds and hearts of many a seminary student. You'd get through your beautiful sermon that you rehearsed 16 times. After all, you only had to preach twice the whole quarter or the whole semester, so you know, you really got to know that one sermon well, and you'd get to the end of it and the prof would look up and he'd say, so what? And that's going to be the test that we will apply to this. If you didn't answer the question, so what? You didn't get the job done, was what was clearly taught in seminary. And you are all the keepers of the so what. So, anytime you see so what on a slide, it'll appear large like that. It's your job to say out loud, so what? I'm going to test you. Let's try it right now. Test.
So what?
Little more.
So what?
1, 2, 3.
So what?
Hey, there we go. Did Jesus substitute out the woman or the man in the process of becoming incarnate? Well, God became incarnate by our own admission through birth. He became a little baby. And that little baby, I'm sure, looked a lot more like the one in the corner than the one in the middle. We all want the one in the middle for ourselves, but did anybody get one of those? No, you got the crying one, the one that gets a diaper rash. And oh, they didn't have diapers back then, at least, well, swaddling cloths, rap. But God entered into a human race. Also, God entered into a human culture. I mean, he had to be something. Could have been Roman, could have been Greek. But he'd been working with the Jews for a long time. Why not stick where he's been doing all of his business to date? So he comes in as a Hebrew. And a gender had to be picked, so Jesus was born male. I personally hold to the belief that if Jesus hadn't been male, we wouldn't be here, because a woman wouldn't have been granted a hearing, because while Jesus did a lot of interacting with women all through his life, I think it's safe to say that a woman wouldn't have gotten a hearing there. So, we would all be painting ourselves blue and dancing around trees, at least the Europeans among us, the Celtic-rooted ones. And, well, that's how that would have gone. The church has placed all sorts of limitations on women. One of the earliest ones was that women couldn't be priests. We gave them a side job. They can be nuns, but they can't be priests. Well, we've been told this is God's will. This is how God set it up. But we're going to find out really just how those relationships worked out. How did Jesus really act towards women? Starting with the first woman that Jesus met. That would be, of course, Mom. And you would note that God more or less how all of us are created. Of course, it says that back in Genesis. He created the male and female, and it says a little later, and everything he looked at, he saw it was good. But obviously, God likes, and has blessed the methodology of how we come into the world. Now, this is kind of important, because on the books today, as I stand here and read, down the road in the Catholic Church, it is a doctrine of the Church that Jesus, I always lose this word, sanctified all that he incarnated. So all the things that Jesus was blessed and sanctified. And guess what? Women have different parts than men. So it is a current doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church that one of the reasons women can't become priests is because some of your parts were not sanctified. It's true. I mean, you reach a long ways for some of this stuff, because you know what? They can't reach to Jesus and find their precedent, so they make one up from theology. And that's been with us, again, for 16, 17 centuries. Again, no, Jesus is 20 centuries out, not 16 or 17. So, what does it matter that Jesus was born of a woman? Jesus has established for those who would follow him that we are not to embrace the simplistic truth that has been presented to us. Instead, we are to embrace the simple truth that we are sexual beings participating in God's creation, and it's a wonderful thing. Let's consider another woman that Jesus met. Oh, Mary and Martha, the sisters. That was an interesting meeting. Mary and Martha are sitting in the house. Jesus goes and visits. Martha is thinking, oh, it's the Lord, who maybe she didn't quite understand who the Lord was, but she did understand that he was a person blessed by God. And she's running around tightening up the magazines on the coffee table and, dusting the piano. Mary is sitting at the Lord's feet, listening and hanging on every word that he has to say. Interesting precedent being set here. Not only without any encouragement does Jesus take time to teach an individual woman, but even when Martha walks over to the Lord and rubs his nose in it, and he says, Lord, you should be telling her to help me. And he says, no, Mary's picked the better choice. Rabbis didn't teach women in Jesus' day, and rabbis certainly would not deign to teach an individual woman. Whether or not she was even regarded as being able to learn anything, it wouldn't matter, because her soul was of no consequence. There was a debate in Jesus' time among rabbis as to whether or not women had souls. Sort of like sometimes you might hear a less informed pastor than myself allege that dogs don't have souls. Now I know better. And, Jesus, in an environment where there was a question of whether women had souls, didn't have any question himself.
So what?
Good. Good. Well, so what? Jesus established for those who would follow him, and by the way, that's us. So whenever I say that phrase, Jesus established for those who would follow him, that's us, that we are to provide equal access to education. So, guess what? We already did, at least in America, Title IX. And there's some grumbling about Title IX, because after all, we want to make sure our sons all have head brain injuries and can get into that huge football program of ours. We don't want to make sure that the women have all this extra money too. Well, guess what? We do. The precedent is that whether you're in class or in any other form of education, Jesus set the bar. The precedent of Jesus' example with Mary is that women can, should, and do well to choose to live. Let's find some other women Jesus knew. There was the woman caught in adultery. There was an interesting premise at that time. The only way for a person to be involved in adultery is if you were male. A woman could seduce you, and then you could be in an adulterous relationship, but it's only a crime against the husband. Well, Jesus notes that adultery can be committed against a woman too. Now, there's a rather important verse where Jesus, the Apostle Paul writes that there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave, nor free, nor male, nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus, Galatians 3:28. And people often get that kind of misunderstood because we're a whole culture away from that verse. That was a different language on the other side of the world 2,000 years ago, and sometimes those things need to be brought forward a bit. Well, when it says that there is neither slave nor free, slave or free to us means race, because that's how it broke down in America. But in the ancient Mediterranean, you could easily be a Greek person with a Greek slave. You could easily be a Latin or Roman person with a Latin or Roman slave. It wasn't a racial divide, it was a legal divide. This is one of the legal divides that kept women and men in whole different paradigms in Jesus' time.
So what?
Well, that was weak.
So what?
All right, thank you. So what? What does it matter that Jesus taught that adultery worked both ways? It was simply saying Jesus established for those who would follow him that women have an equal legal footing. There isn't a category of laws for men and a category of laws for women. Jesus and finances. Jesus saw a woman give 2 pieces of copper one day. They were known as mites. They were about a 1/4 inch across. I've got a couple. Tiny little things. You could easily see how you could lose one in the straw. He saw a woman give, and it was noted by those who were in line behind her to hand out their gold that she was taking up space in the line for no particularly good reason. She was giving practically nothing. But Jesus was able to recognize, yeah, absolutely, 2 mites, almost nothing. Relatively, it was all she had. And Jesus could recognize that.
So what?
Women, right? Men, only cheaper. A modern poster. But it's true all along. What does it matter that Jesus recognized the financial relative worth? Simply that Jesus established for those who would follow him that we are to recognize the disparity of wages exists and the economic position of women. We're told by some that women are different than men, therefore it doesn't matter. It is irrelevant that they make 75 cents on a man's dollar. Jesus says it's not irrelevant. It is to be recognized. I proved it myself. I rubbed my own disciples' noses in this when that day was before me. What are you doing about it? Women. Well, I already went over that Roman Catholic matter about how men are manufactured a little different than women. Although the factory is still a woman. You'd think that would penetrate some minds now and then. But if you've ever read your Bible and said, I'm going to sit down and read my Bible, and you open up the front cover and you read Genesis 1, and there it is, and there you got the story, 6 days, human beings created on the 6th day, 7th day God rests. And then what would you be immediately confronted with in chapter 2? A whole different story. There is a story in Genesis 1 that says the Lord created human beings. He created them male and female. Male and female, He created them. Hebrew has reflective verses for their poetry. And then another chapter down, and what do you get? The man was created on the first day. There was only one day. The whole rest of the day was spent trying to scrape something together, literally. Scrape some dirt. And breathe life into it. And now we got cats and dogs and elephants and giraffes and zebras and all the other things and mice. And why in the world did He make mosquitoes? I don't know. But in that story, the woman is created last. Out of a rib, spare parts. And Adam immediately recognized the surpassing worth of of a woman over a dog or a cat, but that's kind of where it stood in the story in chapter 2. Now, it would be interesting to know if Jesus, as a rabbi, taught from chapter 1, where males and females were equal, or if Jesus, as a rabbi, taught from chapter 2, where women were subservient to men, created as helpers. So we have our two originals, and in Genesis 2, we have first one and then the other scaled down version of a human being, the original with a copy. Can we know what Jesus thought? Well, this is a cool one because, we can. How do we know that? Well, because Jesus taught us about divorce. And what did he have to say? He said, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. He quotes chapter 1. He quotes the chapter where men and women were created equally. Jesus never quotes chapter 2 of Genesis. Jesus spoke of God making two originals.
So what?
What does it matter that he puts them on equal footing? I don't know if I even need to explain it. Jesus established for those who would follow him that we are to reject gender as a basis for power. Women and girls are at a heightened risk of being infected with HIV, precisely because society and customs today deny them the power to choose whether or not they will engage in sex. Why don't they have that power? Because they don't have the same power as the one who wants to have sex with them. Then there's the woman with the hemorrhage. And by the Mosaic law, she made him unclean when she touched him. This would have made him, in turn, unclean, untouchable for a week. Not only that, he spoke to, of all people, a Samaritan woman. Something his own disciples were scandalized about. That's John chapter 4, if you want to go and read about it. And he asked for something that would go into his body that would be touched by her hand. That's unclean. You can't go up to an unclean person and get something from them, touch them, drink or eat something they have prepared, and not, in turn, by Mosaic law, be unclean yourself. And of course, then there was that woman engaged in prostitution, apparently, who came in and anointed Jesus' feet with her tears and rubbed them dry with her hair. They didn't have very good street sanitation in those days. That was a pretty profound act to dry somebody's feet who had been out walking in the street with your hair. Wouldn't be very nice now to try it a day with horses. Ooh. So we've got a woman with a hemorrhage, she's unclean. We've got a Samaritan who by virtue of race is unclean. We've got a sinner by virtue of occupation is unclean. And unclean is something that we don't understand at all anymore. We think unclean has something to do with something that needs a shower. Well, here this little piggy, and I don't know if you can hardly see it, but the piggy has rubber boots on. This piggy is clean. You could win a 4-H competition with this pig. But that pig's unclean. Why? Well, because it's got a split toe. You figure it out. I can't. And likewise, we have Fido here, who's just had his face down a mud hole. And we would think that Fido here is the one that needs a bath. But Fido is clean. Filthy or not, Fido is clean. Because he has toes. Nevertheless, these three women would all have been rated unclean. Jesus was touched by one, drank from something of another, and was again touched by a third.
So what?
What does it matter? That Jesus defied the rules of his time. Rules that were used to exclude and segregate women from men. He established for those of us who would follow him, us, that we are to ignore and even defy any cultural taboos that exist yet today when they disenfranchise women in our culture or any other that we have influence in. You know, Jesus even lost an argument with a woman. Think about it. This woman wanted her daughter healed. Jesus was busy. And he said, I don't know about that. Oh, and also she wasn't Jewish. Unclean. But Jesus was finally convinced. She said, and it's not a pretty argument for us today, but it says a world about the culture in which the argument took place. How did the woman get Jesus to heal her daughter? She said, even the dogs get to lick the crumbs from the children's table. So even placing herself in the place of the dog. And Jesus said, you got me. Your daughter's healed. Go by, have peace. And the daughter was healed. And that's not the only argument he ever lost. If you read up on Jesus at the wedding in Cana, Mom wanted something from Jesus. She wanted the wine cellar restocked. Jesus says, what has this got to do with me, Mom? And she said, son, you're going to tend bar tonight. And he said, okay, Mom. And he filled up all the cisterns with water, turned them to wine, and the wedding went on.
So what?
Well, what does it matter that Jesus lost an argument with some women? He established for those of us who would follow him that men may not require women to yield simply because we said so. Simply because we're men. It's just not in the precedent that Jesus set for us. You know, Southwestern Baptist Seminary about 4 or 5 years ago dismissed the head of the Greek department because they decided that since she was female, she was unfit to teach men. So if you think we're anywhere done with this foolishness, think again. It's still within our culture. And Jesus even liked kids. Even like female kids. One of the ones that he healed was a girl. So it's not just the boys that he approved. And again, he stepped away from his role of the expectations of a rabbi and did that which his Father in heaven would have him do.
So what?
What does it matter that Jesus raised a young girl from death? Jesus established for those of us who follow him the value of healing the lives and health of all children, girls as much as boys. You know, it's a sad thing that in almost any third world country you can get a sonogram You can't get antibiotics in a lot of these places. But you can get an ultrasound. You know why? So they can tell the girls from the boys. Even more than the girls. That's today, folks. It's all a BS or two. Those who were with Jesus at the end, at the cross, the story that Peg read this morning, it was the women who had followed Jesus, who were with him at the end. The people that the disciples learned from about the resurrection were women. They were the very first messengers. The one to whom Jesus first revealed himself in the garden, Mary, Rabboni, was Mary. Jesus, I didn't have to handpick these things. I simply lead through every example of Jesus interacting with a woman. I didn't leave anything out that went counter to my thesis, because there wasn't anything that was counter to my thesis. Jesus never said one thing that indicates he saw women as less, weaker, or different than men. And it's a sad thing that this even rings kind of funny, but Jesus treated women like people. And we are in a church that never has and ever shall, or we don't have a place on this earth. Neither can we say that we are following